Hey guys and girls, so today we're talking about the Electoral College. You should have a handout for this presentation titled the Electoral College Part 1. You can listen to this video lecture and complete that as you go, or I will also download a copy of the Google Slide presentation so you can do it at your own pace if you would like. The only benefit of doing the video lecture is if you would like more detail, further explanation, and just a commentary in general. Before we get started, I do want to make a clarification or just make something clear with regards to last week's assignment on presidential primaries. Presidential primaries are not how we elect a president. Presidential primaries are how we elect candidates to represent each political party who will then run for president. So this is how presidential primaries is how Republicans select the Republican person or candidate that they would like to run for president. How the Democratic Party selects their candidate that they would like to run for president under the Democratic ticket. So presidential primaries are not the general election. They're just selecting a person who's going to then run in the general election under that particular political party. So let's go ahead and get started with the Electoral College. True or false? The presidential candidate who wins the most popular votes is elected president. So this is actually kind of a trick question. The answer is not necessarily, and we'll see why here in a second. Let's take a look at the historical background. The framers of the Constitution disagreed on how to elect the president. Remember, this is one of the issues at the Constitutional Convention. The two methods of selection were congressional method of selection, meaning Congress selects the president, versus a direct popular election, meaning the people select the president. And a compromise was reached through the Great Compromise, and that compromise was the Electoral College. It combined features of both approaches. So what does the Constitution actually say about how to elect a president? There's two main sections that deal with electing the president. Article 1, Section 2 lays out process for the census. A census is a process that collects information regarding the population of people by state and congressional district. And the census is important because that information is used to determine not just representation in Congress, but also to determine how many electoral votes each state will have. Another article dealing with presidential election and the Electoral College specifically is Article 2, Section 1. And most of what we talk about here today actually will be covered under Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution. So it's always important to note how our government reflects federalism, this idea of federalism. And in the United States government, in our system of government, we actually see this basic principle throughout almost every aspect of our form of government. The Electoral College is another example of the federal nature of our Constitution, of our government. Remember that federalism is the division of power between the national government and smaller state, regional, or local governments. And so the Electoral College ensures that states have a role in selecting the president. So one of the common misconceptions is that when you vote, you're voting directly for the President of the United States. And this is actually not the case. When you vote for president, you're actually voting for an elector who will then vote for you. Each state does have a determined number of electors. So first off, every state is guaranteed at least 3 electors, but how they're calculated, so you have the total number of the state senators and representatives in the House. You add those up and that gives you how many electors each state will have. So we have 2 examples here. In North Carolina, they have 2 senators, 13 members of the House of Representatives, gives them a total of 15 electors. In California, we have 2 senators, like every state, but we have 53 members of the House because we have a much bigger population. So that gives the state of California a total of 55 electoral votes or electors. So this map here shows the electoral votes by state, so you can tell right off the bat some of the bigger states like California, Texas, Florida have greater number of electors. So there are a total of 538 electoral votes. The District of Columbia is not a state, but they're given 3 electoral votes, and that is meant to ensure that the citizens of that district have a voice in the political process. So who are the electors? Electors are individuals selected in each state to officially cast that state's electoral votes. So that's a formal definition of an elector. It's a person that is selected in each state to formally cast that state's electoral vote. So a person has to do that. The framers anticipated that electors would be leaders who would exercise good judgment, but in reality, anybody can be an elector. Most citizens can become electors. There are some exemptions. Anyone who works for the federal government or is a member of Congress cannot be an elector, but that's pretty much it. Electors almost always vote for their party's candidates. The key word there is almost, and we'll talk more about that in a second. So how does one become an elector? Well, if you want to become an elector, you have to be chosen by your political party. The majority or the major political parties usually choose the electors at conventions, which you read about last week. Sometimes party leaders decide who will perform the job. It really kind of varies state by state, so there's no uniform answer for this. But once they are chosen, political parties submit the names of the electors to each state election office, making that formal. And so we have all these states with all these different electors, right? And so how do we determine how many electors each presidential candidate gets? There's 2 main methods that are used here. 48 out of the 50 states use the winner-take-all method. And it's kind of like the name implies. In order for the presidential candidate to win all of the electoral votes of a state, the candidate must win the majority of the popular vote. So if you win at least 51% of the popular vote in the state of California, then you win all 55 electoral votes for the state of California. It's not a proportional system like primaries use, where if you win 51% of the popular vote, then you would win 51% of the electors or the delegates. Not how that works at all for the general election. So if you win the majority, you win all of the electors for that state. That's the winner-take-all method. There's 2 states that use a different method. Nebraska and Maine, they divide up their votes based on congressional districts. So it's more of a proportional system like you saw with primaries. All right, let's take a look at the election timeline. So we have the general election beginning in November. So just because this is a kind of officially when the election begins, it's important to note that the actual election starts maybe a year before this, right? When candidates kind of start to test the field, they launch a campaign, start fundraising. There's a whole slew of things that go into that before the actual election takes place in November. But November is when the general election is held. This is when the people cast their vote. This is when the popular vote is determined. Most people consider the general election to be like the main election, November, but the real election actually technically takes place in December, when the electors gather in their respective state capitals to cast their ballots for president and vice president. We do tend to think of like November being like the real election, because in reality, if we know what the popular vote is, and we also know what the electoral vote is going to be, even though they don't cast their votes until December. In January, this is when Congress comes into session. They open the ballots they've received and they formally announce the official outcome. So that will happen in January, even though in November, everybody already knows who won the election. So how many votes do you need to win? You need a total of 270 electoral votes to win the presidential election. What happens if no one receives a majority? If no candidate has a majority, the House of Representatives elects the president from among the 3 presidential candidates with the most electoral votes. And this is set out as well in Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution. This has only happened once in 1824 with John Quincy Adams. And if this does happen, each state has only 1 vote. So, is it possible to get more votes overall in the election from the entire country, from the popular vote, and not be elected president? The answer should clearly be yes by now. This is an example, recent example in 2000, Bush versus Gore. This was a very, very close margin here, but notice Gore won the popular election by a very, very narrow margin, right? There's actually a more recent example in the most recent election, 2016, with Clinton versus Trump. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by about 3 million total votes. So, all right, guys and girls, that is it for the Electoral College Part 1. Go ahead and finish up your notes and get this turned in. And don't forget to complete the Electoral College Part 2.